Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the Art Table again today. Every so often I do a video about some of the problems that I think are plaguing storytelling in the modern era. Previously, I've talked about the pitfalls of long stories and how they discourage innovation and prevent studios and individual storytellers from looking for a better formula than the one they are using now. Today, I want to talk about a different subject entirely. I want to talk about the way we approach moral storytelling. There are a lot of people out there who will complain about black and white morality, or alternatively, about gray morality, or moral relativism, or postmodernism. The fact is, I think all of these critiques are fair. Both black and white storytelling and moral relativism have extreme shortcomings as a lens to look at morality in stories. Now, I'm not saying it is inappropriate to make a moral point in stories, nor am I saying that all stories require a moral point to them. Yes, you can have parables that make very clear moral points about the world, and you can also have stories that don't engage very deeply with morality at all. Both kinds of these stories are perfectly fine. They are in fact great ways to spend your time if the subject matter interests you. But they cannot be all of storytelling. In fact, just like very long stories and very short stories, which we discussed in the previous video on this topic, both very moral stories and amoral stories, while valid, cannot be a large part of the storytelling landscape. Most good stories will fall somewhere in between the two extremes. The problem is, while lots of people are comfortable discussing one extreme or the other, the paradigms that have been developed to discuss the extremes are not very applicable to the middle. So I've decided to do a series of 2 videos on this topic, one today and one next week, that will discuss the things that I consider when I am constructing a story from a moral point of view. Again, this is not an examination of everything necessary to construct a story, but just the way I think when I am thinking specifically about moral viewpoints in a story. The first tool that I use I refer to as the moral mosaic. The moral mosaic is my attempt to address the problems with both very postmodern and very black and white storytelling. The common complaint of a black and white story is that the characters are very one-dimensional, at least in a moral sense. When presented with a moral question, they will behave predictably. They will either act in a way that is generally considered good, or a way that is generally considered bad. Now let me just say right off the bat that I don't think there's anything wrong with a character being predictable, to a certain extent. After all, if you know a person very well, you have a pretty good idea of how they're going to respond to a particular situation. If your audience is to relate to your characters as if they were people they actually know, then to a certain extent they should be able to predict your characters. But if every character has only 2 patterns of behavior they can pick from, good or bad, then yes, I could see how it becomes very, very bland to just have these 2 patterns of behavior on display all the time. Conversely, if you have a purely postmodern moral viewpoint to your story, if everything is shades of gray, it becomes equally bland because it is very hard to distinguish between something that is entirely shades of gray. If there are no hard lines, if everything is roughly the same color, you get something very boring to look at. A relativistic worldview assumes that everyone is simply behaving in a selfish fashion, and that is actually a less complex world to look at than a world of black and white, because it assumes there is only one pattern of behavior that characters can fall into. The moral mosaic looks at people's actions in an entirely different fashion. We begin with the assumption that yes, there are good and bad actions. These actions are in fact black and white. And I should note that the moral mosaic is entirely about evaluating moral behavior, so there are a lot of decisions that characters will make that are morally neutral, so these aren't part of the questions that we're looking at here. However, the point is we are looking at actions and not at characters. Thus, we can have characters that make good actions and bad actions at different points in the story. So far, so good. This gives us the opportunity to look at a character with some nuance. Characters have more than one pattern, the selfish pattern, to act on, and they have more than 2 patterns to act on. They can be either good or evil, and they will show that in different moments in the story. There's nothing new about this. Characters often have good and bad moments. We talk about giving characters flaws and moments of moral vulnerability. We also talk about their principles, the things they will stand on no matter what, the things that define them as a character in the moral sphere. These clear dividing lines make a character's moral landscape very sharp. They make it distinct. They make it easy to gauge and make predictions based on. Many people will have their characters make one moral decision, such as sparing a person's life even though they pose a very real danger, only to turn around and make a contradictory moral decision in another situation. For example, cutting the hands off another person so that they will not pose a danger. This will be considered morally nuanced storytelling. And in some situations, perhaps it is. We're going to talk more about that later. Right now, what we are talking about is the importance of very clear-cut lines. Your character must have guidelines that they follow and that the audience can either deduce or are informed of, so that they can somewhat predict what the character is going to do. Having a black and white moral mosaic makes this much easier to do than having a shades of gray mosaic. A bunch of very similar gray tiles together just makes a blob, where a number of black and white tiles cannot help but make clear patterns, even if those patterns are very, very complicated. The second thing to keep in mind is magnitude. A mosaic is a number of tiles of the same size all grouped together, but that doesn't mean that they have to alternate in color. Some spots of a mosaic have a large number of white tiles in one place, and in other places a large number of black tiles. Your character's moral behavior can very much be the same. He can make decisions that only influence a few people for the worse, a small scattering of black tiles. And he can make decisions that affect a lot of people for the better, a large scattering of white tiles. The reverse is also possible, and of course, some people at one end of their life may have a lot of white tiles, and at another end of their life, a large number of black tiles. Or vice versa. The trip from one end of that life to the other is what tells us how those tiles got to be that way. Again, more on this in another video. For now, the point is the size and scope of a person's moral decisions also informs us about who and what they are in the moral sphere. So that is something you must take a lot of care to weigh and balance as you build a character's moral mosaic. Finally, as you look at a character's moral behaviors, it is important to keep in mind that mosaics have patterns to them. There is a theme to them. You must build an image through each of the tiles that you put in place. So it is with a character's moral mosaic. It is true that no person in real life has one moral theme running through their life. It is also true that fiction and reality do not correspond 100%. I know, you're shocked. The truth is, it is almost impossible to show the full breadth and nuance of a character's moral behavior in the scope of a single story, or even a series of stories. So if you wish to present a character who is coherent and predictable and relatable to your audience, then you must actually be a little bit unrealistic in the way you depict their moral behavior. You have to give them a theme and clear articulated principles that the audience can latch on to, or they will not actually be able to treat your character as if they were real. Strange, I know, but it's true. Now, this doesn't have to be an epic, sweeping moral narrative. You can take a simple moral principle like do one good deed every day, and you can build a moral mosaic out of that just as easily as you can build a moral mosaic out of the idea that a character has to rout corruption out of a very powerful and deeply entrenched institution. Regardless of what you choose, your character has to have a moral theme if you are going to build a mosaic of that theme into your story. If there is no theme, you probably don't have a story that needs a moral sphere to it at all. You may be dealing with one of the simple, straightforward, amoral stories that do exist and are perfectly fine to tell. But the reality is, every aspect of a story is very intentional. If you are going to include questions of morality in your story, you must be as intentional with it as you are with everything else. Thus, having a pattern in mind for your moral mosaic before you begin is a definite must. That isn't the sum total of good moral storytelling, of course. It is very complicated and nuanced. But for the most part, I think this is the foundation that we need to have in order to discuss very complicated moral stories going forward. Or at least it's one that I've developed and I found works very well for me. But it isn't the be-all and end-all of this discussion either. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, as I said before, next week when we talk about Othello morality. But right now, we're going to leave it there. Let me know what you think of the moral mosaic down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and if it seems like a useful system to you. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.